Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Jim Westdorp, Chief Technologist at Ciena Government Solutions. Jim, good to have you with us.
Great, Tom. Great to be with you as well.
And so much is happening on networking these days as governments, agencies try to modernize their networks and for various purposes, such as better customer experience. And going back to the token ring and LAN.
Oh, yeah, that's been a while, but yeah.
Really seen a lot of evolution. So what do you see ahead that would be state of the art for modernizing federal networks? Let's start there.
Yeah, sure. I've been in the industry over 20 years now, and Ciena as a leader in optical solutions, of course, has been around for that amount of time as well. And we've kind of grown from a company that's focused on optical systems to one that's focused on critical infrastructure of all kinds, from the core all the way through the enterprise edge. And the sorts of things that we're seeing, now is, of course, there's always the push for more capacity. That was actually one of the things that Ciena was founded on. That's a little humorous today, but an entire system back in the day when we were first starting out was 40 gig. That was an entire rack of equipment, and that's all you could get in an entire fiber. And now that's a single wavelength, and you can get terabits. But so of course we've seen the inexorable push for more capacity. The main stock and trade in bandwidth and networks has moved from a gig or 2.5 gig to 10 gig to 100 gig, which is now pretty much the standard unit of currency for larger networks. And we're moving to 400 gig. And, within a couple of years, we'll be about a terabit, per wavelength, per client. So some very substantial changes and evolution in terms of the amount of capacity. And, with the amount of capacity that networks can carry, we're trying to converge the networks to support both packet, which is the dominant traffic type. So Ethernet and IP packets is really the dominant kind of traffic, which carries all your applications. But there's still a fair bit of what I'll call legacy, older protocols, which are time division multiplex networks, Sonnet and SDH. So we're trying to put all that together and converge that into a single overall network, so that you can work all your services and applications across a single network and not have disparate networks for storage and Sonnet and Ethernet. You can do that all at once. We're certainly seeing the impacts of the move from, or I guess the increased usage and the position of data centers in the network. If we were 10 years ago, 10 maybe, but a little more than 10 years ago, there weren't large, huge data centers. Now there are gargantuan data centers, and we're actually even moving off of just the large scale data centers to a hybrid model where there's a mix of edge data centers and and centralized one. And then and that's pretty much the core of the network. And then if you start looking towards the edge, probably the biggest trend these days is all of the money that's being spent towards 5G infrastructure. So moving from 4G and LTE to 5G. And we're not a radio vendor, but of course all the networks that support all those radios are built on Ciena equipment. So that's a big change in our
Sure.
in the capabilities of our equipment as well.
Yeah, lots of questions here. And you mentioned Sonnet, and you're in the optical business. What are the trends specifically in optical to be able to handle these terabit types of networks as you envision it? And then I want to get into, how Wi-Fi and wireless and 5G.
Yeah, sure. Right on the pure optical, on the optical side. So we've, as I mentioned earlier, we've been moving from 10 gig to 100 gig to 400 gig. 100 gig is still pretty much the stock and trade. The largest networks that we build, particularly for the government, are still based on 100 gig. But if we look at what the content service providers are doing, Google, Facebooks, and even the larger AT&T and Verizon, they're now starting to move to 400 gig, specifically 400 gigabit Ethernet. So that's a new standard on the client side. So basically quadrupling of the speeds that the routers or switches or individual application servers are going to be able to move data between large processing nodes. And then if you look at the fiber itself, we've actually moved, Sienna in particular has moved to being able to carry 800 gigs per wavelength. So we can carry, actually I mentioned 400 gig is the new standard for clients. That's what, the standard for interoperability amongst switches and routers has moved to 400 gig. But we can carry now 2 of those on an individual wavelength. And then we can carry actually 40 or 50 of those. And so, we're now up to 20 or 30 terabits on a fiber pair. And that's just in one of the major bands that we can carry. We're now actually moving into the L band as well, which is a different frequency band where you can carry another 40 wavelengths or so. So we're in the total capacity now. We're up in the 50, 60 terabits that we can handle on a fiber. So immense amounts of capacity that we're now able to supply over fiber optic infrastructure, which is what really makes bandwidth isn't free, but it's effectively not a limiting factor anymore.
And for those on the federal side who like some of the technicals, are we talking about operations at layer 0 where the wavelengths are, or does it extend up into the Ethernet layer also?
Yeah, it goes all the way up, and for Sienna, for our equipment, the 800 to terabit capacities that I'm talking about per wavelength, that's what we would call layer 0. So that's the physical layer over the fiber. When you're getting into into layer 1, so now that's the switching layer, which is the current standards are ODU standards. Those go up to 100 gigs. But at the Ethernet layer, so layer 2, yes, that's 400 gig E. And the next set of standards haven't come out yet, but we're going to be either a terabit or 1.6 terabits. So huge increases coming. Basically, the increases don't stop because the demand from the users and our customers doesn't stop. So,
Got it. So there's change going on at the Ethernet level, but also at the Sonnet level too. That you mentioned, that's an
yeah,
old
now the
standard.
Sonnet level, that's an interesting question. Those standards have been static for quite some time, and those are really not evolving. The news, if you will, there is that we can continue to use those older standards, even though they're really not they're not going beyond, actually Sonnet's not going beyond 40 gig, but we can still operate with those older protocols and carry them across modern infrastructure. So we have ways of converting those Sonnet signals and Sonnet protocols into either OTN, which is a modern TDM standard, or what's more common actually is to convert it into Ethernet and carry it as packets across the network. And that way you get the optimum efficiency, and you can still use your older equipment at the edge that still speaks Sonnet SDH because you've got a translation layer. And so it really is kind of, sure, a lot of people in government and otherwise talk about just replacing all their Sonnet gear, but as a practical matter, that's very hard to do. It's by and large out of the core and even the metro parts of the network, but it still exists at the edge, and there's some, particularly for government applications, there are existing sensors, both from a satellite and even radar perspective, that still use these older protocols, and they're systems that are still working, and it will cost a tremendous amount to replace. So you can't not support it, but you support it in such a way that you can use modern critical infrastructure and still support the older protocols that they need to speak at the edge, and that's something that we support as well.
Yeah, that edge idea is really coming into fashion right now, for lack of a better
Yeah.
word. It had been not thought about that much in the cloud era, and people thought about their hybrid infrastructure in terms of clouds and data centers.
Yeah.
But edge computing, closets, you might call them, or just nodes of computing that are neither data centers as they're traditionally understood, nor commercial cloud providers. Agencies are I guess, understanding the importance of that amount of computing that they have at the edge because of Internet of Things, sensors that you mentioned, and a
Yeah.
host of applications.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been, it's been interesting to see the evolution of the network. In the early days, of course, bandwidth was relatively, expensive. So things were concentrated, and then bandwidth got cheaper, and so things got distributed again. And then all the bandwidths kept creeping up, which lent itself towards more centralization, which is where the big data centers came in. But then the architectures and the applications changed to the point where doing everything centralized, while it's efficient, you still now have to move a lot of traffic to that centralized data center to do your compute there and then bring it back. So it became inefficient again, and particularly if you want low latency in some of the new applications that you really need to be physically close to the data. So that's where the data centers started to become distributed again, and now you want compute at the edge. And so yeah, that's actually, I would say, some of the more recent trends in the network are, we're certainly not, the big data centers aren't going away. We're not needing any fewer of them, but we need to augment them with compute and storage deeper in the network, closer to the users, so that we can enable some of the really interesting applications, some of the virtual reality, some of the gaming things, even some of the things we're talking about in terms of smart networks and smart roadways, and anything that requires interactivity between the user and the compute. You really need to be physically close. Now, that still can mean a few hundred miles, but it's not like you're going halfway across the country to a large data center. That you still want to be able to do, but you don't want to have to do that all the time.
Sure. And there's also even a cybersecurity aspect to this. A lot of agencies, especially in defense, want to distribute instances of applications or virtual machines to be distributed as widely as possible,
Yep.
because that means that nothing can take down that application unless it takes down the entire network, which is pretty hard to do even for a sophisticated hacker.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot nowadays. There's a lot of redundancy built in the network, and we at Ciena and others in the industry spend a great deal of effort making sure that A, we can build a network with sufficient redundancy when it's necessary, and B, we can take advantage of that redundancy. And in the event of a failure, in the event of a cyber attack, you can use the redundancy, excess capacity that you built into your network to survive that failure, that attack, etc. Part of that is yes, moving to the edge and having a more distributed network, which by its very nature is more resistant to failure and attack, because there are a lot more of the edge nodes. And so even if there's a problem in one place, yeah, that one place just went down, but everything else is still fine. So lots of interest and lots of movement towards the edge, which has really been driven by the ubiquity and cheapness, really, of compute and storage. Kudos to the semiconductor industry and Intel and AMD and all the others that have made compute and storage very, very inexpensive, to the point where you can put it pretty much everywhere, and you can start to take applications that historically have demanded discrete appliances, and you can virtualize them in software. Examples of that are the classic examples are virtual routers, firewalls. You can now do, you're not doing terabits worth of encryption, but you can do gigabits worth of encryption, in software nowadays. Network acceleration, and the latest interest in terms of software-defined networking, SDN, is in terms of software-defined wide area network, SD-WAN, or even SASE, which is secure access service edge. All of these things are taking advantage of the ubiquity of compute, storage, and high capacity networking to be able to do really important functions at the edge that historically haven't been able to do, but now you can. And the result is a much more capable and resilient network.
All right, more questions, but right now we're going to take a break. My guest today is Jim Westdorp. Chief Technologist at Sienna Government Solutions. I'm Tom Temin. This discussion is The Future of Networking, sponsored by Sienna Government Solutions here on Federal News Network.